Hi, folks. Thanks so much for joining us today. I think we're going to go ahead and get started pretty quickly because we have a full schedule. So thank you so much for joining us for trauma-informed interviewing and practices on campus. I'll be your host for today. My name is Priscilla Clausen. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a project coordinator here at Valor. And then we also have Ashley with us today. Ashley, did you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley. I'm glad to be here. If you have any trouble with your technology, feel free to send me a direct message and I'll do what I can to help.
Thanks, Ashley. And then our presenter today, we have Janet Neely. She's a legal consultant with Valor US. And Jan, you can go ahead and take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Priscilla. It's great to be here. So let's go to before we go to the next slide, I'll just say I've worked for Valor as a legal consultant for about 3.5 years, ever since I retired from the Attorney General's office in California. In the California Attorney General's office, where I spent most of my career, I was one of the state experts on sexual assault and domestic violence. And also I was an expert on sex offender risk assessment as well. So I come with that kind of background, but I worked with CalCASA, now Valor, for many years on the California Sex Offender Management Board and the Sex Offender Risk Assessment Committee for the state of California. So that's the background that I bring to this work. Okay, let's go to the press conference slide. So we'll start out by just letting those of you who are with us, and we have a small group today, but I'm really happy those of you are here, give you the chance to ask any questions that you feel are important as we begin, any topics you want to know about today, talk about any challenge facing your campus that might be on your mind or problem that your campus is having currently. Or feel free to ask more questions about my experience or my work for Valor. So I'm going to open it up to those of you in the audience right now and give you a chance to, just say what you're thinking about today.
You all should be able to unmute yourselves, or of course, you're welcome to use the chat.
Well, if no one's having any challenges on their campus or problems, congratulations. And we will just move right on and start with what we're talking about today. So today's plan is to talk about the campus culture, what we know about it, what we might want to know about it. And then we're going to talk about neurobiology of trauma and various types of trauma before we get into the nitty-gritty of how to do a trauma-informed investigation and interview. And that's the first half. Next week, the second half, will go more into what are the new California laws that apply to campuses. We'll do a little bit of Title IX, but it'll be mostly focused on California law. And we'll get into some of the more details about the legal requirements. Okay, next slide. So our learning objectives today are just learning how to gauge campus climate and maybe some thinking about how we can change or influence culture on our campuses, reviewing the brain science, and doing a trauma-informed investigation and interview. Next week, we'll talk more about options that can be given to survivors, as well as the new laws. And then at the end, we'll go over a little bit over restorative justice, what that is and what kind of option that could be on your campus if it's not already. I'm actually not going to do a trigger warning today because the newest research is showing that when people are given specific trigger warnings, that they tend to cause more anxiety than the actual material itself, even for someone who may be sensitive to that material. So we're just going to move right along, all right, and go into assessing and dealing with campus culture. So let's go to the next slide, Priscilla. So campus culture definitely can influence rates of sexual assault on a campus, and how that's conveyed to people on the campus, to students. Well, it happens in various ways, but here's one example. There is a campus in Central California that's well known in the Cal State University system, and they have a main road into the campus that runs past a bunch of fraternity houses in a row. And when the parents are coming into town with carloads full of things for kids moving into the dorms, the first thing they see as they're driving past these frat houses are signs on the lawns of the fraternities saying, "Parents, bring your daughters to us." To me, that's a not so subtle sign that there might be some campus culture issue that needs to be dealt with on that particular campus. There's less obvious ways that the culture is conveyed to students as well, but that one was like a bright neon blinking sign for the administration, although I'm not sure that they saw it that way. So one of the things that we have to do, those of us who work in the field on campuses, is to help the administration gauge the culture in order to bring about the changes that are necessary when they are necessary. And of course, normally they are. It's also a better idea to do this before you have a disaster than after you have a PR nightmare hit the campus. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one school that did have that kind of PR nightmare and how they dealt with it. But just think about how much better it would have been had they figured this all out before it blew up in their faces, right? Next slide, Priscilla. So this case is the Dalhousie School of Dentistry case. And the Dalhousie School of Dentistry is a small dental school in Canada. And what happened was that some male dental students created a private Facebook page with all kinds of derogatory, misogynistic, and sexually harassing material about women who were their classmates at the dental school. And eventually, one of the women who was being targeted on the Facebook page heard about it from one of the men and blew the whistle. And the school found out as a result of her report, and an extensive investigation ensued after that. The women who were victimized, who were being targeted on the Facebook page, chose to go through a restorative justice process that was offered at that time through the university where the School of Dentistry was housed. And the restorative process was a holistic process that was aimed at identifying and understanding the factors that led to the formation of this kind of Facebook page and what made it seem okay to the people who initially put it up and were contributing to it. Next slide, Priscilla. So the investigation turned up, not surprisingly, the result that this was not a one-off. It was not an anomaly, especially for the faculty of the dentistry school. It turned out there were several relevant and similar past instances, some of which had even been known by the faculty or administrators and addressed by them, although most of them had not been communicated to the rest of the faculty, sometimes for legitimate privacy reasons, others not so much. But those past instances combined with what had happened in this particular case suggested that sexism and homophobia and racism were deeply rooted issues that were affecting the faculty. And as a result, influencing the students and relationships between and among students, staff, and faculty, which is not surprising. So the restorative justice process began going through a series of exercises that reviewed how to do community building within this school, looking at inclusion and equality and how that worked or didn't work, a review of the professionalism and ethics for the school, the curriculum and program structure, and they ended up looking at the reporting processes and conflict resolution processes as well as part of this. Okay, Ashley, or sorry, Priscilla. But in the process of doing all this, the case became a huge cause célèbre on campus. There began to be threats and public denouncements of the process by other faculty at the university who weren't even on the faculty of the dentistry school. And at the student union, there were denunciations. Some professors tried to quash the restorative justice process that was taking place in the university senate. There were anonymous threats against various people. There was a lawyer who represented the one member of the Facebook group who had opted not to enter into the restorative justice process. And that attorney was making false and misleading statements about the process. And there were efforts going on at the same time by the Royal College of Dental Surgeons of Ontario to collect identifying information on the students while the investigation was still ongoing. Some of the men received threats of violence on social media, and some of the female victims who were being harassed by the original Facebook group started being harassed online for their temerity in bringing forward the case. So there were protest rallies at the School of Dentistry. There were petitions against misogyny and gendered violence. But then there was also this attempt by the faculty to quash the whole investigation. So it was crazy. And it's the kind of PR nightmare that, you know, your president of your university is hoping won't happen. Okay, next slide, Priscilla. So how could they have dealt with this earlier? Possibly through a campus climate survey. In 2014, when the White House, the Obama White House, was sponsoring the Not Alone initiative, they developed a Bureau of Justice Standards survey, which was tested on 9 campuses and then published in 2016. So this was a White House task force to protect students from sexual assault. And part of the task force goal was that the climate survey they developed would help schools understand the magnitude and nature of sexual victimization on their campuses experienced by students. So the task force was specifically encouraging all schools to use that climate survey they developed, and it had a toolkit that included it. There was in 2014 a Office of Violence Against Women Act funding for a test pilot campus survey that was used by a number of campuses in order to test it and see how valid the tool was. Next slide, Priscilla. So the kinds of things that the climate survey measured were campus demographics, school connectedness. And that's one thing about the dental school case, was that it was a very small school. So doing a climate survey and then trying to find ways to deal with the problems that turned up would have been on a far different scale than it might be for those of you who are working on big university campuses with thousands and thousands of students, undergraduate and graduate both. And it's possible that in that environment, it might almost be better, in addition to a full scale climate survey, to do individual ones for various subsets of the campus, because the climate could change or be totally different, say at the law school, than it is in the English department, The climate survey measures look at experiences with sexual harassment and coerced sexual contact. There are detailed follow-up questions when somebody identifies as a survivor on the survey. It also talks about intimate partner violence, as well as sexual assault and school climate related to both sexual harassment and to prevention efforts. So that is basically what the climate survey was trying to measure. So I'd like Priscilla to do a poll. The next slide is a poll for those of you who are with us about what your campus experience has been. So Priscilla, I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks, Jan. So I've just launched the poll. You all should be able to answer. Has your campus done a campus climate study? Yes, no. If you're not sure, that's fine. Just let us know. And then if you have done a campus climate study, when was that done? In the past 2 years, in the past 5 years, or within the last 5 to 10 years? And it looks like about half the folks here have responded that yes, they have done one. I am going to close this poll and share the results in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks for answering those questions, y'all. And I'll let Jan, can you see the results?
Yes, thanks, Priscilla. So that's really interesting. Almost 75% of your campuses have done a climate study. Only about 9% saying no, and about 18% not sure. And then over half of the ones that answered yes said it's in the past 2 years. So that's also really interesting. 9% in the last 5 years. So it sounds like most of your campuses do have experience with doing a campus climate study. And that's good. That's good. So one thing I'd be interested to know, if anybody is willing to share, is once you did the climate study on your campus, what did the campus do with the knowledge that it got from that study? Is anybody willing to talk about that?
You can all feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to share, or if you're more comfortable, you can share in the chat as well.
Well, let's go to the next slide, Priscilla. So one specific question I have for you is, was it helpful? For those of you who said, yes, you've done one in the last 2 to 5 years, was it helpful to have done it? And if so, yes, let me know why. And if it wasn't, why not?
Pilar from Caltech shared in the chat that it was helpful to do the climate survey because it gave a starting point of how to view the culture of the school.
Oh, well, that's, yeah, and that's actually the very point of climate surveys usually. So that's good to know. Thanks, Pilar. Well, I think that campuses might be skittish about climate surveys, partly because they're afraid of what they're going to find out. And of course, campuses are always worried about liability. And, it might or might not help or hurt the campus with liability issues, but that's going to depend on follow-up, in my view, as an attorney. And so if you've done a campus survey, which identifies significant issues on your campus, and then there's no follow-up to address those issues that are discovered, I think it could definitely be a liability problem. So for a campus that does one and then tries to bury the results, I think it could be an issue. If they get sued later for their processes in dealing with a particular sexual assault. Okay, let's move to the next one. Yeah, you already did. Thanks, Priscilla. So if you do a climate survey, and you'll find out in a few minutes that, in fact, those of you who haven't done one are going to be doing one soon when I start talking about the new law. But the pitfalls to avoid when you do one are illustrated by Stanford's experience. Stanford did a climate study in 2015 after they were encouraged by the White House task force, which ended up saying that the sexual assault rate at Stanford was only 1.9%. Well, students didn't believe it. They thought that was just unbelievably ridiculous. And it caused a campus uproar, and as a result, total skepticism about the report. The problem was that Stanford had devised their own study because the template climate study hadn't yet been released by the American Association of Universities that was working with Bureau of Justice Standards to do the model one. So when Stanford devised their own study, they used the definition of rape under California law as their only definition of sexual assault. So instead of covering all forms of sexual battery and touchings, as well as rape, penetration crimes, the only crime that they surveyed was penetration under the definition in California law. They did look at other types of sexual misconduct, but when they issued the report, the only statistic they cited was the rape statistic, 1.9%, which is what led to the uproar. The other problem was the pool of students that they chose to participate in the study. Even though they had over 9,000 students participate in the study, the biggest subgroup was male graduate students, probably the least likely group to experience a sexual assault, right? So that just made no sense. I'm not sure whether they engaged advocates to help design the study, but that their definitional use and their choice of what to highlight from the study was what got them into hot water. Okay, next slide. So California has a new statute this year, goes into effect in January, and it adds a new section to the Ed Code, section 66293. And one of the requirements of the new code section is that all the CSUs and community colleges but not the UCs unless they want to. So it's voluntary for the UCs, have to participate in the development of an online campus survey after it's posted online by the US Secretary of Education. So apparently the Department of Education, federal level, is working on this now. And once it's released, what you're mandated to do is to help develop questions in consultation with experts on your campuses or in your area to determine student perspectives on campus climate. You have to consult with student organizations, trauma experts like us, like Valor or other local rape crisis centers, so that the questions that are developed are trauma informed. And then you have to submit the questions that you develop on your campus to the Secretary of Education for approval and hopefully inclusion in the online survey form. And then 1 year after that survey becomes available in final form, and every 2 years after that, you have to submit a report on your published campus results to the California legislature. So everybody is about to be doing campus climate surveys. I don't know where they are at the Department of Ed in terms of developing the initial template that they're going to release for campuses to participate in refining, but it's something that your campus should be keeping an eye on, because starting in January, you're going to be mandated to participate unless you're from the UC. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about Dalhousie and how they changed their culture. So when the university at Dalhousie began investigating as part of the restorative justice process, the goal was to address the harms caused, but also to examine the climate and culture within the faculty, which might have had an influence on people feeling free to put up Facebook pages like that. 29 students out of 38 students in their core four-year dental program participated in the restorative justice process because it affected everybody, right? Not just the women who were being called out by name on the Facebook page. And 12 of the 13 men who were identified as members of the Facebook group participated as well. One of the things they decided was that they needed to find more supportive and better ways to build connections between students, faculty, and staff. And the solution they came up with was called wellness circles. So these were circles that met on a regular basis, and they included students and faculty to discuss things that were happening and, feelings about them on a regular basis as an ongoing way of connecting students with each other and faculty with students. They also restructured traditional social events of the school, especially the faculty, to make them more inclusive. And they also tackled inclusion and equality, looking at ways that they supported diversity and ways that they could confront divisions that they'd had along lines of gender, race, culture, and religion by mixing students from different programs and backgrounds and providing special resources for international students. So again, I think it's easier to do that on the small scale that Dalhousie had with the tiny numbers of students that they had to deal with than it would be for us on a huge campus. But like I said before, that could be broken down into smaller units on the campus, or departments, or schools. Okay, one more slide on Dalhousie, next one. So they had to address their ethics, obviously. They tried to change their professionalism standards to reflect principles rather than rules, starting with faculty-student dialogue becoming more an honest and open conversation where people listen to one another. That was the idea of the wellness circles. And those circles were done through facilitators. On the curriculum, they redesigned ways to interact and work within the faculty and to interface with students. And they provided restorative justice training, not just for administrators and faculty, but also for students as part of this new way of addressing it, by giving everybody skills to be able to do conflict resolution. So that's really interesting that they provided more restorative options, and they trained more people among the faculty and the students to do that kind of work. So it was more of a problem-solving approach that they developed as a result of everything that happened. Okay, next slide. All right, this is our first breakout. We're not doing a lot of breakouts today, so I think this is our only one today, actually. So what I'd like you to do is, we've got 13 people here today, so we're going to form 2 breakout rooms. Just talk a little bit about what you do know about your campus climate, and if you don't know much, what you'd like to know, what things you think need to be changed on your campus, and maybe the possible solutions. If you can identify one person in the group to take some notes, and then when you come back, we'll have that person share with the whole group. Okay, we're going to take about 5 minutes to do this. Okay, are we all back? I'm going to assume we are.
Yes.
All right, so I don't know how to say which group, but there should be one person from each group who could share with the whole class about some of the things you talked about.
I'm happy to jump in for group 2, or, I'm happy to wait my turn as well.
No, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. My name is David Reyes. I'm a senior investigator at USC. Individuals in my group raised concerns around consent education, helping individuals, students to understand what the consent requirements are. As a senior investigator, I've seen issues where consent may be unclear, right? Individuals don't understand really what affirmative consent is, even though we have, I'm sure at all our universities, copious education for Title IX related issues, affirmative consent, as well as special training for at-risk groups such as athletes, residence life, student clubs, and orgs. And so the topic kind of comes up in the sense that sex is, in the United States, taboo, right? It's not something that's often spoken about, and students find their own ways to educate themselves, whether online or amongst themselves. That is, I think, an issue that is pretty common to most campuses. Another issue that I raised was education around healthy drinking habits. Again, drinking is taboo, but we all understand that drinking occurs even by individuals who are under the age of 21. And there's no education around it because, again, it's taboo, it's illegal. They're not supposed to be engaging in these activities, and yet they are. And when they do, they're over enthusiastic and underprepared. Right. I've seen in situations where students drink from bottles directly, right? Liquor bottles, and it's not a good way to meter how much intake or alcohol intake someone has, especially when they have little to no familiarity with alcohol, which leads to a lot of at-risk situations where people are making poor choices or individuals may be incapacitated. And personally, I'm an advocate for providing more education, even to students who may be under 21 for alcohol, to help them understand, what does a drink look like, right? This is a single drink. It's one shot. There's this many ounces of whatever you're mixing it with or what have you. So people aren't, or students, what have you, are not engaging in at-risk behaviors or potentially even, sexual assault aside, becoming sick from alcohol consumption or drinking themselves into a hospital room, which is something that nobody wants. But we all understand that these are activities that students do engage in.
Right. So it sounds like there's a lot of concern in your group about just how students are being educated about consent and healthy drinking habits, and whether or not the education that we're doing is reaching them or effective.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. At USC, do they have like an online required education program, or is there any in-person training?
Sure. So we have a double, I don't want to say bifurcated, it's not the right word, but a dual approach, of course, right? So we have our online training, which all the students are required to participate in. In addition, we do hold in-person trainings for many of the different groups, research assistants, international students, athletes, the athletic department in general, clubs and orgs, Greeks, things like that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of resources there, but helping students to stay engaged, being able to answer questions, and also informing students whenever I do trainings that we do more, my office for equity, equal opportunity in Title IX, do more than just investigate, right? We can provide resources and provide supportive measures, and helping to articulate. This is one big thing for me, that you can come to us, not disclose what happened to you, and merely seek support. Some students are not interested in having a full investigation, but I and everyone in my office is very interested in making sure that individuals receive support whenever they may be impacted. Right? And we do that in a myriad of different ways. So that's really the big focus. We want to put individuals, especially individuals who may have experienced conduct that violates our policy, in the driver's seat, right? Of within reason. Sometimes there are needs to initiate complaints on behalf of individuals, but typically we put individuals in the driver's seat.
Yeah. All right, great. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Yeah. Would somebody from the other group be willing to share what the concerns were among your group?
Hi, I'll share. My name's Daniela Herrera, and I was in the group with Andrea and a couple of other ladies. I don't think they had the opportunity to share, but both myself and Andrea are pretty new. She's from USC. I'm coming from two community college campuses, Rio Hondo and East Los Angeles. So because we are new, we don't have a lot of experience there, but what I really thought was unique that Andrea is engaging in at USC is that she's part of a wellness committee. So it sounds like they have a pretty comprehensive program that includes more than just the wellness, but she happens to be on wellness. And what I found really interesting and really key actually is that she mentioned that prior to joining, I think herself and some of the group members felt that they didn't really have like permission to do self-care. And I come from East Los Angeles Women's Center, which is a sexual assault and domestic violence crisis center. And when working with a lot of the women there, we do find that when there is trauma, there is a really they have a difficult time being able to self-care, and that affects self-esteem and self-worth, and then can lead to like higher risk behavior. So I think it's really incredible that they are focusing on wellness as well as other stuff, but wellness is incredibly important. And then for myself, what we're trying to do in the community colleges is, of course, bring a lot of awareness to sexual assault and domestic violence, but also to really provide resources, especially like non-traditional resources that can really be preventing a student from having their best like day, life, whatever they need to be able to put one foot in front of the other, right? So I will refer them to the therapist for one-on-one counseling and support groups, but I will also, I also do this other thing where I will locate whatever resource that student needs. So That can be from just a self-care, self-hygiene packet, so shampoo, conditioner, shower gel, like basic necessities, or to I am helping them locate like better study habits or stress management. So really a variety. And then another unique thing that we're doing is we are, myself and therapists will be hosting support groups, like a healing circle that will allow the student to come and really have a conversation with ourselves, but more importantly, build community that they have each other to lean on, not just during college, but even afterwards in life.
Wow, that's really interesting. Thank you, Daniela. Sounds like your campuses are working on a whole variety of ways of helping students either learn more or receive support when they've been traumatized or experienced some of these issues. So that's very helpful. Thank you.
I
Thank
also wanted to highlight Deborah's comment in the chat. Deborah's from USC, and she clarified that they hold a 2-hour required live programming for first, second, and third year undergraduate students, in addition to the online training that all students are required to take. It's a live virtual programming. So it's for first, second, and third, and then they're all required to take the online trainings that are, I believe they're like a self-paced program.
Oh, that's really interesting. So it's live in the sense that they're still on a computer, but it's happening, and somehow you know if they're participating or if they've checked in.
Yeah, I'm sure there's like a component where you can see who has attended, just like a Zoom. And
Mhm.
so it's live and I'm assuming interactive. Deborah, if you want to pop in, or it's via Zoom with our prevention educators, staff, and student workers.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's great because a big campus, it's so hard, and yet all the research shows it's so much better when it's live, rather than simply, clicking through screens and thinking it's just something you have to check off in order to enroll or whatever. So that's really interesting. Yeah, thank you. All right, well, we're going to move into the trauma portion unless anyone else has a comment. Okay, all right, let's do it. One of the really interesting things I discovered in putting together this webinar today was a different way of thinking about trauma. In the past, when I was training about trauma, I was thinking about the immediate trauma that the survivor was dealing with, the sexual assault or sexual harassment that had occurred. And what this information that I came across led me to think about was the fact that for many of our survivors, trauma is not just from the immediate event that's happened, but it's a combination of traumatic factors or events which compound the trauma that is the most recent one that they're experiencing. So next slide, Priscilla. So there's different kinds of trauma that you can think about. And we're going to talk a little bit about, not a lot, but a little bit about each one. But as you can see, there's all different ways of thinking about trauma. So, for example, next slide, Priscilla. Environmental trauma is trauma that can be triggered by feelings of neglect or helplessness or loss from conflicts that are observed or felt in their social and physical environments. And those kinds of traumas have obviously negative health implications for the person or for a family or indeed for a whole community. There's the next slide, spiritual trauma, which is an impact on somebody's sense of meaning, whether it's their view of God or their concept of self, but it can affect people's understanding of what they perceive as good and evil, or justice, or pain and suffering. And it could have an impact on their own inner belief system, which can impair their connection with the world that they knew it, as they knew it, with God, or the universe, or however they think of their place in the world. It can totally impact how they're feeling about the world. Next slide. Cultural trauma. Cultural traumas when members of a group feel they have been subjected to a horrendous event that leaves a mark on their group consciousness, which could mark the memory of that group forever and change their future identity in fundamental ways. And we can all think of groups in our society that are still experiencing that kind of cultural trauma today. Next slide. Generational trauma. Research has been conducted on how trauma passes down through generations, as there's stories and fears and survival techniques that have to be passed down from generation to generation, and populations within which that kind of generational trauma have been identified include Holocaust survivors, Native Americans, victims of mass genocides, like the one conducted by Stalin in the 30s. So that is a trauma which might belong to a group, and it's very real, even if it is not something that actually happened to the person who's now going through their own particular trauma, right? The next slide, Priscilla. There was a study of a genocide in the early 30s in Ukraine called the Holodomor, I'm not sure I'm saying it right, genocide. And it was studied by scientists, and they saw impacts from that genocide that continued over time and over generations. That included risky health behaviors, anxiety, shame, food hoarding, because they were being starved. They weren't allowed to leave their villages and their cities, even though there was nothing to eat there when this genocide was happening. So they were basically starving people to death. And it resulted in things like authoritarian parenting styles, high emotional neediness on the part of parents, and low community trust. In other words, what many described as living in survival mode. And that makes sense for the people that experienced that starvation and that genocide. But what was interesting was that that impact of that trauma continued through generations who had not actually experienced the starvation and the genocide itself. So another kind of trauma. Next slide. That's similar to historical trauma, which is a trauma or a wounding, which is a shared trauma rather than an individual experience, and can be again passed down to multiple generations, so that current members are experiencing trauma-related symptoms without even having experienced those past traumatizing events. Next slide, Priscilla. So dominant cultures often silence or diminish the value of other cultural groups' stories or narratives. That is, the culture may disqualify other people's knowledge and limit what may be discussed publicly about it. Again, re-traumatizing, right? The people who've already been traumatized. One example, next slide, is Native American women. Colonizers used sexual violence as a tool of conquest in America and Canada. Native children were removed from their homes, placed with non-Native families, or Native children were forced into boarding schools and abused there. Another example, next slide, was African Americans, because slavery meant forced sex with white men and with other enslaved people. They were often considered bed warmers. There were plantations that were just for producing more slaves. Rape did not legally exist for people who were enslaved. There was a case in Mississippi in the mid 1850s that said, quote, "The crime of rape does not exist in this state between African slaves. Our laws recognize no marital rights as between slaves. Their sexual intercourse is left to be regulated by their owners. The regulations of law as to the white race on the subject of sexual intercourse do not and cannot, for obvious reasons, apply to slaves. Their intercourse is promiscuous, and the violation of a female slave by a male slave would be a mere assault and battery." So it's hard for us to wrap our heads around a society that thought that way. And yet here we are 150 years later, and the effects of that kind of thinking are still apparent in our society. Next slide. Similar to that, myths about Black girls. There's this cultural mythology about them that people think of them as older than white girls their own age, or that they need less nurturing or protection than white girls, or less support or comforting, or that they're more independent than white girls, or know more about adult topics like sex than white girls do. Those kind of stereotypes and myths, we all know, persist today in our society. Next slide. The implications of that kind of historical trauma also still exist, right? So look at the backlogs of untested rape kits. In Detroit, and this slide's kind of messed up. So Detroit should say 81% of Black women's test kits felt that race was a factor in why their test kits just sat there, had languished forever without being tested. In Cleveland, Cleveland should be over the middle text. It was a $10 million lawsuit filed over the fact that they had such a backlog of untested rape kits. And in Memphis, 90% of Black women felt that their race was a factor in why their rape kits weren't being tested. So those are all Cleveland and Detroit and Memphis cities that have high percentages of Black people in the population. And whether it was true or not, they felt that their race was a factor in why the kits were not being tested. That, you know, that may or may not have been true, but the historical trauma to which their race had been subjected and their gender led them to believe that, and you could see why. So next slide. So these are all barriers, right? Leading to distrusting the system, and they're not based on nothing. They're based on their collective trauma and experience of things like police brutality or lack of response to sexual violence when it is reported. Things like overrepresentation of men of color in the prison system, broken educational systems, the fallout from the war on drugs and crack cocaine especially, and immigration and deportation policies. So it's interesting because when we're training investigators about how to do trauma-informed investigation, it's not just misinformation or ignorance about the trauma and the neurobiology of trauma itself that poses barriers. It's possible misinformation about historical and system traumas. And it's possibly belief in some of the myths that are counterproductive to effective police investigations or to informed counseling. Right? So next slide, we're going to talk a bit about the brain and trauma. But let me just point out, if it's not obvious already, that far from being a neurosurgeon, I barely passed biology in college. So I'm going to share with you what I know, but if you have more in-depth questions, I probably am not the right person to ask. Nevertheless, this is really helpful for various reasons to understand a little bit about the brain science, even if it's a very rudimentary understanding like mine. Because for one thing, when you're trying to convince a hearing panel or a jury about what happened to somebody, to a survivor, sometimes the science is more acceptable to them as an explanation than an explanation of the various other kinds of trauma that we just talked about, right? It's more accessible and it seems rooted in science, and therefore they're more willing to accept the explanation about the survivor's behavior or conduct if it's rooted in an explanation that seems scientific. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Before we continue on, we did have a question in the chat about trauma.
Okay.
Andrea is wondering if there are tools that you can recommend for implementing reduction of generational trauma.
Sorry. Just getting over a cold here, you guys, in case you couldn't tell already. No, I'm not aware of any tools that you can use to help survivors who are dealing with historical or generational trauma. That's a good question. And I would think that maybe some among you in the audience who are counselors might have an answer for that, but I don't.
Okay, thank you, Jan. We'll move forward, but yeah, if anyone has any suggestions, please feel free to add those in the chat, or Ashley, if you have any recommendations, we can add those in the chat as well. And
Yeah.
Andrea, we'll see. Oh, it looks like Ashley has a book recommendation, but after the training, we'll also send out a handout and whatever recommendations we come up with in the chat.
Okay,
But it
great.
looks like Ashley has, it didn't start with you, how inherited family trauma shapes who we are and how to end the cycle.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you, Ashley. Okay. So before we knew as much as we do today about the brain science of trauma, you know, you didn't really need scientific research to understand victim responses to trauma because they're really not based on neurobiology, but understanding how the neurobiology deals with trauma might be an easier way to explain to a hearing panel or to a judge or a jury what happened. So, for example, there are plenty of psychological and social reasons why most victims don't physically resist during a sexual assault, or why it takes a while to tell somebody about the assault, if you ever do, or why it's hard to report it to law enforcement. And there are plenty of psychological and social reasons to explain why many survivors maintain a relationship with a perpetrator. Many professionals in the field understood those types of victim behaviors and responded appropriately long before they knew anything about the neurobiology of trauma. Nevertheless, the neurobiology is really interesting as well and also explains a lot. So here's a little diagram. The prefrontal cortex is in charge of your cognitive function or reasoning. So when someone experiences a traumatic event, the prefrontal cortex goes offline and your limbic system kicks in because that's our survival mechanism. So cognitive functioning is basically shut down at that point. And then what is triggered is an involuntary reaction triggered by the brain of fight, flight, or freeze, right? Cortisol is a stress hormone and serotonin, and those are sent to the same receptors. But when cortisol levels become high, such as during a sexual assault or a traumatic experience, cortisol beats out serotonin because our brains are switched into a survival mode. So cortisol increases, serotonin decreases, and as a result, memory of events happening during this time period can be fragmented, can be foggy. Okay. So next slide, Priscilla. So the survival reflexes that get triggered are either an alert, a temporary redirection of our attention to assess a potential threat and determine our need to react. The startle response, which is called flinch, could happen. That's a physical reaction that is generated immediately to protect the body from a sudden threat. There's the acute stress response of flight or fight, which is a release of adrenaline and cortisol that is preparing the body for action and activating major muscle groups, but that at the same time may impair or bypass rational thought and inhibit complex task completion. Okay, so it may not be easy to, well, you're no longer thinking things through logically, right? I've seen a fourth one added sometimes to this list of alert, flinch, fight, or flight, and that is called fawn, meaning being nice to somebody, trying to talk them out of what they are obviously intending to do that would hurt you. Okay. So I think you're familiar probably with tonic or collapsed immobility, which means going either rigid or limp. This is a response that happens sometimes, and it's induced by extreme terror coupled with either actual or physical restraint, the inability to get away, to escape. In many animals, this is a last-ditch survival tactic, and research shows that up to half of childhood sexual assault survivors experience this kind of reaction. Either they can't move, they can't feel pain at the time that the assault is happening, or tremors happen, or they can't speak, their body temperature plummets, or they have a fixed focus stare, which is intended by the body to take awareness away from what's happening to the body, or they can retain sensory awareness while tonic or collapsed immobility is happening. So the next slide is an illustration of how this happens with an animal. So Priscilla's going to play it.
What happened?
Okay, you're on YouTube. You have to explain this. How did you do that?
I just flipped him on his back and started petting his head.
You're still living in today. So here is the bunny show. These are live bunnies here. But this one, what's his problem? Miller Lite, right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Miller Lite. This bunny is breathing. Don't you have a story to tell?
No.
Can you tell me? You won't tell me the secret, huh? Okay.
Okay. That poor little bunny, of course, it's amazing. More of them were traumatized by the level of noise in that show, 4-H showroom, whatever it was. But that is a good example of tonic immobility, right? The bunny is scared out of its wits, and its body takes over control and it freezes. And you know, this can happen to us even in a minor traumatic situation. So, for example, one time I was walking through a parking lot and a car suddenly started backing up right towards me. And, you know, the logical thing to do at that point would have been for me to quickly scoot out of the way of the car that was backing into me. But my body froze me to the spot, which was crazy. You know, was not a good response to what was happening, but it was beyond my control because the brain took over and dictated the response. It wasn't necessarily a helpful response, but that's what happened. So the logical part of me that should have said, hey, run, didn't kick in. So it's interesting. Okay, next slide. So when there is a threat, we get sometimes a sharpening of the senses, a focus on the threat and exclusion of anything on the periphery. We're not noticing anything but what's happening with the threat itself. And that survival reaction is occurring before we can make any kind of conscious decisions. Time slows down, actions take longer or seem to, and distances can be overestimated. Basically, the brain temporarily deactivates our emotions. So it suppresses our emotions in order to facilitate the critical response it thinks we need, whether it's right or not. And it creates sometimes a sense of unreality or detachment from what's happening, disassociation, which is described by many people who've survived a trauma, including sexual assault. Okay, next slide. So trauma can change your brain on many levels, from the way you make decisions down to your subconscious responses to what's happening. And part of the reason it can be so hard to overcome the effects of trauma is it goes after several areas of your brain at one time. According to a study by the National Institute of Health, trauma mainly affects 3 important parts of the brain: the amygdala, which is your emotional and instinctual center, the hippocampus, which controls your memory, and the prefrontal cortex, which regulates emotions and impulses. So all 3 parts work together to manage stress. And even when you're just reminded of a traumatic experience, your amygdala, the emotional and survival center, can go into overdrive and act just like it would if you were experiencing that trauma for the first time. Your prefrontal cortex is also suppressed, so you're less capable of controlling your fear. You're stuck in a purely reactive state. And trauma also leads to reduced activity in the hippocampus, one of whose functions is to distinguish between past and present. In other words, at that moment, your brain can't tell the difference between the actual traumatic event and the memory of it. It perceives things that trigger memories of traumatic events as threats themselves. So trauma can cause your brain to stay in the state of hypervigilance, suppressing your memory and impulse control and trapping you in a constant state of strong emotional reactivity. So that is one of the reasons why we look so carefully at how to do trauma-informed interviewing and investigations, is because we risk otherwise having this, rekindling or re-experiencing of the trauma happening to the person that we're interviewing. Next slide, Ashley, or Priscilla, sorry. So the way we respond to the disclosure of a sexual assault is really important. We can either assist in turning it into something good-ish, or as good as it gets in that moment, or we could inadvertently contribute to a bad response, and maladaptive. In other words, we can even cause the brain to create neural pathways that bypass the memories themselves or obscure them. So there's plenty of research and evidence telling us that a supportive environment is the greatest determinant of whether or not a person who has been sexually assaulted will develop symptoms of PTSD or depression or other types of mental health problems. And that's why it's so important for people to receive support rather than hiding what happened to themselves, right? And that makes sense to us. Okay, so that's our brief overview of our brains on trauma. Now let's look at trauma-informed investigations and interviewing. Next slide, Ashley. California law requires a comprehensive trauma-informed training program for all campus investigators and adjudicators. If your campus hasn't made it clear, ask where you can see that curriculum. It might not be one that somebody like you who've just been trained on trauma-informed investigations might expect it to look. Rape crisis centers have expertise about neurobiology and trauma, but it would be best if you find a way to share that with a campus and with Title IX and with other people who are working within the system on campus before a case actually happens, because it's easier to train about this stuff before you've got a major issue on your hands, right? Next slide. So Education Code 67386 specifically says California campuses have to provide comprehensive trauma-informed training for campus officials who are involved in adjudicating and investigating all the stuff we're talking about today. And that investigation and hearing must be trauma-informed. Resident life student and non-student staff have to have this training annually if there's on-campus housing. So on most campuses, the hearing panels are often drawn from deans and administrators, student conduct administrators, sometimes deans and administrators who know nothing about either trauma or sexual violence, and they have to have the same kind of training that you're having today. Next slide. So you may think this is basic, but it's really not basic to everyone. For example, when law enforcement is trained on interviewing people in the academy, they're trained to be objective observers and to kind of take a hands-off approach because they don't want to appear biased, right? But the problem with that when it comes to trauma-informed interviewing is that methods that would help a traumatized person to remain engaged and to participate if they've reported during the investigation process are very different. And the main difference is that empathy is required. So what to a law enforcement officer might seem like the proper attitude, a hands-off kind of neutral face and position of the body and a listening attitude, but asking lots of questions, are not going to come across as empathetic to a survivor. It's not going to come across as somebody who's prioritizing their needs And that's why we're talking about these specific interviewing techniques today. The first thing to do is return control to the person you're talking to. And there's subtle ways you can signal that you're returning control, having to do with who's seated, you know, where. You're not going to be behind a desk. Hopefully you've got a soft interview room with without a, you know, just hard furniture. Hopefully you've got some soft furniture where you can sit maybe cat a corner to the person that you're talking to and without a barrier in between you. That's a subtle signal that you're returning control to the person that you're talking to, right? You're not in a position of an interrogator behind a desk. Being empathetic requires starting off with some expression of sympathy and understanding that this is hard and what happened to them is not fair and it's hard. And then it's using interview techniques that facilitate effective recall of traumatic memories. And finally, it's understanding the difference between trauma and dishonesty. A lot of the things that people manifest who've been traumatized will be mistaken by somebody like a law enforcement officer who hasn't had this training as indications of dishonesty. Next slide, Priscilla. So understanding trauma can be a real game changer for law enforcement investigators and prosecutors and professionals who work with survivors. But as we go through this, remember there's a risk if people take unwarranted leaps from a general understanding about trauma to any assumption about a specific survivor's response, right? For example, just because we know about tonic immobility doesn't mean we should assume that somebody froze during their sexual assault, because not everyone does. We can't assume they suffered extreme prefrontal cortex impairment and lost all rational thinking capability, because not everyone does. And we shouldn't assume that, you know, the only behaviors a person will engage in while being sexually assaulted are passive or ineffective, because sometimes people do fight back, right? Not always, but sometimes. So even if somebody says something like, I felt like I couldn't move, it doesn't necessarily mean they experienced tonic immobility. So open and careful listening is the first component after empathy. And returning control to the survivor. And it involves asking open-ended, non-leading questions to gather information and fill in the picture, which will often have the result of providing us with unique or new or surprising aspects that we might not have gotten to if we hadn't taken this more low-key approach, letting the survivor control the way they tell their story, right? So it's not making assumptions, because everyone's trauma is different and occurs within the broader context that we talked about already. Chronic trauma, historical trauma, cultural trauma. There's all kinds of traumas that could be compounding what we're dealing with. Everybody handles being ashamed in different ways too, and that can vary by culture. So we're trying to do everything we can to counter any shame that somebody might be feeling as we talk to them about these issues. Next slide. Stress really affects memory, and critical stress most of all. So sensory perceptions might be distorted during a stressful event. Details that you expect someone to remember might not be retained by a traumatized person. Certain details of the incident might be retained with very high intensity, on the other hand. So it depends what the brain stores and doesn't store, or doesn't let you access. They may be memories that are stored haphazardly and recalled completely out of order, and that's totally normal. Crisis memories may be more strongly linked to the senses than to conscious thought, and that's why when we talk about trauma, we're going to talk about eliciting memories by talking about the senses. And finally, crisis memories can often be implicit, not explicit. They might not be conscious at the front of their thoughts. And as you let them take control and lead you through the interview in the order of things that they think of, rather than chronological order, like a law enforcement officer might have been trained to do an interview. If you let them control it, you'll find that memories may surface and become more explicit. So next slide. The benefits when survivors are left to tell the story in their own way are manifold, right? Survivors don't make assumptions to fill gaps in their memory, which otherwise they might do if you were asking them a specific question that they didn't know the answer to, right? If you're not asking questions, but you're leaving them plenty of open-ended ways to tell their story, they're not going to be making stuff up because they just want to answer your question. Sometimes survivors can deal with their own stress by adding details later as they become more comfortable with the interview and the interviewer, when they're not feeling challenged, when their perceptions of the event might differ from other information sources. So if somebody tells you something that happened and it's different from something a witness has already told you, you're not going to jump in and say, well, you know, from another source, I heard this that contradicts what they've just told you, because that is a challenge that they don't need to hear at that point in the story. Now, later, after they're completely done with telling their story in their own way with your prompts that we'll talk about, then you might have to ask them some specific questions. But until they've got the entire story out and are done, you shouldn't be asking those kind of questions. So this is an attempt to make sure that they're not as re-traumatized as they tell their story, and they're not put on the spot just because some memories are missing or delayed. You know, it's basically helping them recall an incident without causing an acute stress reaction that's similar to the original incident, right? And even if they can't think of everything the first time, doesn't mean that they might not go home and think of something else. And so, you know, you would be telling them, obviously, that if they think of anything else, to get in touch later on, because that can help, that can happen, that happens all the time, right? All right, next slide. So, inconsistent statements. Apparently, the more primitive areas of the brain do a really great job recording experiential and sensory information, but don't do so well recording the kinds of information that professionals who are investigators have been trained to try and obtain. So most interview techniques that have been developed to interview rely on the advanced portions of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, right, the logic center, and are looking for specific detail like color of a shirt or description of a suspect or a time frame, that kind of thing. And some victims can provide that information in a limited way, but most trauma victims are not able to accurately provide that kind of information. When they're asked to do so, they may inadvertently provide inaccurate information and details, which then causes the fact finder to become suspicious of the information they provide. So stress and trauma are routinely interrupting the memory process and changing the memory in ways most people don't really appreciate. So one of the mantras within the criminal justice system is inconsistent statements equal a lie, and that is absolutely false. Nothing could be further from the truth when stress and trauma are impacting memory, and research shows us that. So pressing people for details when they actually don't remember or know those details can result in people making them up just to please us. All right, this is the next slide is a YouTube video. Dr. Rebecca Campbell, who's an expert at Michigan State University on trauma, is going to explain how she came to the realization that law enforcement training is often counterproductive to interviewing trauma victims. Okay, go ahead, Priscilla.
And I got interested in this issue because I've done a lot of research with law enforcement, and they've talked about how when victims come in to give their report, what they say doesn't seem to make sense to them. It seems suspicious. They don't quite believe what the victim's saying. They don't believe the way the victim's acting. And I was sort of curious about that as a psychologist of, well, the victim's behavior makes total sense to me. Why doesn't it make total sense to you, law enforcement? So this presentation is about taking what we know from psychology and about neurobiology and how victims act, and trying to bring that to the criminal justice system so that they can understand why victims are acting the way they do, so that we don't start off the entire interaction under a cloud of suspicion. This process has been very interesting for me, and it goes back to an experience I had way back right after I finished my PhD. I was doing some work with the Chicago Police Department. I was a young pup, my late 20s. I knew everything, as you do in your late 20s. And I was working with a sex crimes unit detective who knew everything, and we both knew everything. And so he was 100% right that most victims lie, and I was 100% sure and right that most victims don't. And I remember that experience very vividly, of me looking at him like, you're obviously wrong, and he's looking at me like, you're obviously wrong. And so we just kind of agreed to disagree and just went about our lives. But I always kind of came back to that of, how is it possible that we're both so sure we're right? And I'm thinking, all I need to do is just give him the research. So in my subsequent career, I did a lot of trainings with law enforcement where I had all my graphs and my tables and my charts. See, here's the rates of false reports. And they're still looking at me like, right, we don't believe you. And when I started interviewing them and they started saying these things like, well, she's making it up as she's going along, this is sketchy, I'm like, oh, well, that's the trauma. That's what psychology is. And that's when my light bulb went off of like, oh, once we can get to the root causes of understanding victims' behavior, that's what law enforcement are hungry for. That's the information that they want. So since I've started bringing this into my work, it's been that light bulb experience for law enforcement of, oh, that's why I'm seeing what I'm seeing. And their attribution has always been that I'm lying, and why they were 100% sure they were right, because they saw this behavior. And they were right, they saw the behavior, but their attribution about it, I think, was incorrect. And so what I've been able to do in my practice, in research and in victims, is sort of say, let's bring what we know from science into this. This is why this behavior is happening. And let's focus on that and understanding that, and take away all the attributions about lying and dishonesty and making it up as you go along. Let's get to the root of the case and go investigate the case. And law enforcement have been very receptive to this message because they found their behavior curious. Now they have an answer.
Yeah, next slide. So that is really true. How she ended by saying, you know, once you're able to show them how the trauma is a manifestation of the science, and why inconsistent statements will be the norm when a memory is formed under severe stress, then it's a game changer. It really is. I did a training on this, I don't know, 7 years ago, maybe, at the University of California at Berkeley. And they had Dr. Jim Hopper doing the training on brain science. He's really great. It's from Johns Hopkins. And then they had, you know, kind of a much expanded version of what I'm doing for you today. And one of the female officers who was at the training told me later that it was such an eye-opener that she was ashamed, thinking back of the kinds of things that she had put survivors through in her career of doing sexual assault investigations, because she hadn't understood about trauma and about when it was the trauma that was causing the inconsistent statements that were happening, or the fragmented recall. You know, she couldn't believe what a difference it made to be able to know that, and then to handle an investigation and an interview in a totally different way. So criminal justice training teaches us that when people lie, we can see changes in body language, in their affect, that we'll hear pauses like that, lack of eye contact. And they don't understand without this training that these are natural and expected when people are asked to recall a traumatic event. So good, solid neurobiological science shows us that when a person is stressed or traumatized, inconsistent statements are not only the norm, but sometimes they're strong evidence that the memory that we're talking about was in fact encoded under the context of severe stress and trauma. And in addition, what many in the criminal justice field were educated to believe people do when they lie, such as changes in body language or affect or pauses or lack of eye contact, actually occur naturally when human beings are highly stressed or traumatized. Science of memory and psychological trauma is just, you know, the thing that changes people, but it has to be done in a context that can understand why the science of memory is well, scientific, basically. I mean, you can talk all you want about social and psychological reasons, but when you base it on neurobiology, it's much easier for cops to understand in general. I'm sorry, it is. Okay, next slide. So doing trauma-informed interviewing involves a number of things that don't come naturally to people who've been trained to do investigations as law enforcement. There will be pauses when you're interviewing somebody who's been through a stressful, traumatic situation. Let the pauses go on much longer than you normally would, and don't interrupt. There will be contradictions. Don't call people on contradictions until the very end of the interview when they're completely done with telling their story, and then go back and address them if you need to. Don't give unsolicited advice or use anything that could be construed as victim blaming, right? I mean, that's just a given. Clarifying questions, wait until the entire statement is done before asking questions to clarify or establish specific details. Don't jump in as you go along and ask about those details. And finally, if you have to ask questions that might be upsetting, like what somebody was wearing that night, wait till the end and then explain the reason why you have to ask questions that may seem upsetting or may be construed as blaming by the survivor. So questions about their alcohol or drug use, their clothing and behavior, any questions about sexual anatomy or actions, sexual orientation, gender identity, personal relationships, personal beliefs, those kinds of things. Explain why you need to ask those questions so that they understand you don't intend them to be blaming. Okay. Next slide. So allow recall in whatever way works best for the survivor. Let them control the content and direction of the interview, and don't force a chronology on the interview. They're going to recall things not in a chronological order normally, and that's fine. You can put it together later. Again, allow time for pauses and try to continue wherever they leave off. After a pause, if you need to do a prompt, just listen and lead them back to what they were talking about. Next slide. Full interviews shouldn't take place till the survivor has had 2 full sleep cycles. The initial interview that helps us locate a suspect or evidence or arrange a medical exam, those interviews should be kept to a minimum. Patrol officers, if they're involved, they rarely have the training to do a full interview properly. And those fuller interviews should be left to either detectives if police are involved, or Title IX investigators if the campus is involved. All right, so we've only got about 7 minutes left, so we'll see what we can do with this, or we could start with this when we come back next time. I don't want to rush it. It's really an interesting, it's an interviewing practice that's really interesting. I have a volunteer think of a traumatic event, and then I have one person volunteer to interview them about that traumatic event, which could be anything. Could be a car accident, a child who went missing in a store for a few minutes, the death of a pet, anything somebody's willing to share. And then the first interview uses a typical law enforcement technique for who, what, when, where, and why questions. And then the second interviewer, who will be me, will try and do a more trauma-informed interview of the same person with the same traumatic memory. And then we'll discuss it afterward. I think we'll start with this at the beginning of the next training next week. So because I don't want to rush it. So let's just look at the last 2 slides, Priscilla, of the day, and then we'll come back to this at the beginning next time. So whether you're doing a hearing in front of a Title IX panel, or even if you're involved with somebody who's going to trial, which is less common, but happens. Counselors who have worked with victims of sexual violence can dispel common misperceptions about how victims react to sexual abuse. And they can talk in general terms about trauma at a hearing if the survivor's behaviors seem to be inconsistent or paradoxical with having been sexually assaulted. Local rape crisis centers often can identify somebody who can come in and talk as an expert. That person is not going to be made familiar with the particular facts of the incident that's being adjudicated. Rather, they're going to be just speaking in general about trauma and about normal victim behaviors to show that a victim's behavior is not inconsistent with having been raped. So for a lot of people who aren't educated in this field, they'll think, well, she went back and texted the guy the next day, that must mean she's lying. Well, it's explaining by a neutral person who doesn't even know that that was a fact in this case, that can often happen, and that people often do go back to their abusers. People often do contact their assaulters again. For a manifold number of reasons, and explaining what those reasons can be. So you would have a counselor with expert knowledge review the facts without knowing any of the personally identifying information, and provide a statement about why behaviors that happened are not inconsistent with the truth. This happens at trial all the time, and the prosecution can rely on an expert like this who doesn't know the people involved or the facts of the individual case. Okay, and there's nothing says you can't do that in Title IX. So finally, resources, learning trauma-informed interviewing. Russell Strand has a 5-day case for law enforcement and investigators on this that I've taken. It's a really great class. You have to have taken the brain science part of it first. But the practice in doing trauma-informed interviews in this course is really great. So here's the link to the FETI course, Forensic Experiential Trauma Interviewing is FETI. And also the Ashland, Oregon Police Department has a course called You Have Options for campus and local police, which they will bring down to California police departments who want the course as well. Of course, you pay them to bring it down, but still, it's a really great class too. So there's a couple of resources for law enforcement and investigators on your campuses. So thanks for being such a participatory audience with the breakouts today. I really appreciate it. And we'll come back next Wednesday and we'll start with that exercise on doing trauma-informed interviewing. Hope you guys have a great rest of the week.